As the homologation approval period for its limited production RC45 came to an end in '99, Honda surprised everyone with the announcement that it would introduce a new liter displacement V-twin superbike in its upcoming 2000 model lineup alongside the then-new inline 4 CBR 929RR. With four-cylinder machines still limited to 750cc in superbike racing, the declaration was an obvious sign that Honda had decided the replacement for the multi-cylinder route was displacement. However, that meant taking on Ducati at its own twin-cylinder game. Naturally, the Honda Racing Corporation, the racing arm of Honda of Japan, played a major role in the design of the new twin. The bike was designated the VTR 1000 SP1 everywhere in the world except the United States, where it was known as the RC51. In its very first year, the Honda RC51 proved its performance potential by winning the 2000 World Superbike title with Colin Edwards aboard. Meanwhile, in the AMA Superbike series, a young Nicky Hayden just missed out on the title to Suzuki's Mladin by a slim 5 points. Edwards grabbed another world title in '02, and Hayden picked up a win in the Daytona 200 on his way to the '02 AMA Superbike Championship. Meanwhile, the RC51 was an instant hit with sportbike fans. Its booming exhaust note was its own sound, distinctly different from the Ducati twins, and decidedly unlike any other Japanese production bike. The twins' HRC heritage could be seen throughout its design and was proudly displayed on the engine cases. And not only did Honda put this works racing replica machine in showrooms, they offered it at an extremely affordable $9,999. Compared to the limited production $27,000 RC45, this Honda was a bargain. The RC51 was snatched up across the country. Although import quantities couldn't quite be considered production level, it's rumored that about 2,000 were brought into the US in the first year. The aforementioned HRC influence is also evident in the RC51 engine's architecture. As with the RC45 V4 before it, the 90-degree V-twin used gear-driven camshafts, an arrangement providing more precise cam timing and better horsepower, but one that's also very expensive to produce. With such a large bore, big valves could be used, and Honda obliged with 40mm intakes and 34mm exhausts. For comparison, the Ducati 996 had 36mm intakes and 30mm exhausts. Even the engine fueling system was racing-spec. The Honda PGM-FI used a pair of 54mm throttle bodies, while at the time of its introduction, its twin-cylinder competition used smaller units. Honda also went with 2 injectors per cylinder. All the others had a single injector per jug. Running a big V-twin involves certain long-term reliability concerns, as the cases undergo tremendous stress at 5-figure RPM levels. So the RC51 was restricted to a relatively low 10,000 RPM redline, with a rev limiter stopping the party shortly thereafter at 10,200 revolutions per minute. In addition to the restrictive stock mufflers, the artificial RPM limitation kept the showroom stock bike down to about 118 horsepower at the rear tire. The frame was built to withstand the rigors of superbike racing, so its construction was quite beefy and stiff right from the factory. This meant it was also a bit heavy. With 24 5 degrees of rake and 105 millimeters of trail, the steering geometry was obviously aimed at stability over agility when combined with the short 55 5-inch wheelbase. Honda claimed a dry weight of 432 pounds, but after topping off fuel and fluids, the bike was something like 489 pounds, quite a bit heavier than one might imagine a sport bike would be. Nevertheless, it was competitive with the Aprilia RSV and the Ducati 996, its primary adversaries at the time, although it was roughly 50-pound heavier than Honda's CBR 929RR. The 999cc engine was also rather thirsty, and its low 28 mpg average meant that even the 4.8-gallon fuel tank was only good for a 140-mile range at the most. Throttle response was not quite up to Honda standards on the 2000 to 2001 models, with an abrupt response off closed throttle that would upset handling mid-corner. In 2002, Honda released a new SP2 model featuring a host of upgrades, most of them directly from the race kit for the SP1 model. It made about 5 more horsepower, much of that due to larger 62mm throttle bodies and redesigned cylinder head porting. Remapped fuel injection curves and finer 12 jet injectors helped eliminate the previous throttle response problem. Other major changes included sharper steering geometry, with the rake pulled back to 23.5 degrees and trail shortened to 94.6 millimeters, and each side radiator getting its own fan to address overheating issues. The new swing arm was basically the SP1 race kit model, and stretched the wheelbase by 16 millimeters while adding rigidity and cutting weight in the process. The SP2 model had a taller windscreen developed from Colin Edwards' World Superbike mount, as well as redesigned mufflers for less weight. All told, the SP2 dropped about 8 pounds. Those who spent time on both the SP1 and SP2 report that the differences were noticeable, with sharper handling and better fueling the most apparent improvements. While the Honda may not have been the sexiest bike ever produced, it does have a certain purposeful look. It's not trying too hard, and looks like a race bike should. The annual production of this bike was fairly low. It did not attract the typical aftermarket supplier's attention when it came to go-fast goodies. Back in the RC51's heyday, the first place to look was Kyle Racing proprietor Dan Kyle stepped into the RC51 aftermarket parts arena in a big way, establishing himself as a major supplier for the new Honda Superbike. At the time, Mr. Kyle said the RC51 may not be the fastest bike around the track, but the owner usually finishes the day with the biggest smile. When asked about popular modifications for the Honda, Kyle said the first parts usually added to the bike were an aftermarket exhaust and a power commander. On the SP1, the fuel injection needed some help to smooth out the throttle response, and the PC went a long way toward correcting that issue. As for the exhaust system, Kyle said extensive in-house testing showed that very few, if any, of the full exhaust systems make any more power than the dual slip-ons offered by Sato and Moriwaki. Each saved a total of 10 to 11 pounds. Other popular choices among riders were Arion, Jardine, and Akrapovic. While most of the 2-in-1 exhaust systems offered slightly higher top-end power, it came at the expense of the mid-range that V-twin riders enjoy.